Okay. You guys ready? Whew. Okay. My gosh, I walked over here, had to take my coat off, right? So nice outside. Why are we here? I don't know. Yeah, it's my fault. It is. We'd rather riding horses, wouldn't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, oh well, what can we do? I don't know of any horses in the area, so we're stuck.
We're stuck.
Okay. Okay, so today what we're going to do is cover arteries, arterioles, and then get into capillaries. Okay, and turn that on. Okay, hemodynamics. So here is like kind of the definition of hemodynamics. I'm assuming that you get that in your, or you had that in your physics class, right? So, so obviously I'm not going to ask you what the definition is. What I am trying to get at with this is we need to understand pressure, flow, resistance in order to understand what is going on with our blood vessels. Okay? And flow. You should know what flow means, right? Things flow from one area to another. And the thing that promotes flow through, obviously we're talking about the vasculature here, is our pressure gradient, or delta P. Okay? And when we're talking about that pressure gradient, we're talking about the difference between one end of the tube to the other. Okay? So that's what promotes flow. If you think about it, when you turn on a hose and you put water in on one end of the tube, that increases the pressure on that end and causes the water to move throughout the hose. Okay. Okay. So that's that. And obviously we're always going from higher to lower pressure. But there is a big thing that impedes the flow, and here we're talking about, obviously, of blood through our vasculature, and that is resistance. And resistance, when we're talking about that, is due to friction. It could be the friction between the blood and the wall of the blood vessel, or just friction within the layers of fluid themselves. So when we're talking about the flow of blood through our blood vessels, this is laminar flow. So you have all these layers kind of blood that are flowing in parallel through our vasculature. Okay, so that's resistance. And we're going to look a little bit more at what goes in. Oh, so there's our flow equation. Flow equals delta P over R. I don't expect you to remember a whole lot of equations, but this is one I do expect you to remember, okay, is our flow equation. And so we want to look a little bit more at what goes into resistance. So first thing is blood viscosity. And I'm thinking about you're drinking through a straw glass of water. Okay? It's really easy to do that. But then you have this nice thick milkshake, and you're drinking that through a straw. Is it easier or harder to drink through the straw? It's harder, right? Okay. And so that's viscosity. Obviously, the milkshake is more viscous, has an increased viscosity. And so if we're thinking about resistance, okay, is viscosity directly or inversely proportional to resistance? It's going to be directly proportional, right? So the greater the viscosity, the greater the resistance. And since our flow equation is delta P over R, the greater the resistance, the decrease the flow. Okay? What can change the viscosity of our blood? The main thing that gives our blood viscosity is our red blood cells. So if you change the hematocrit, which is the percentage of red blood cells in your blood, that would change the viscosity. More red cells, it's more viscous. That would cause a greater resistance and hence reduced flow, okay? The length of the tube is the other thing, okay? And remember, when we're talking about the tube here, we're talking about blood vessels. And here's my other example. So, which one, and if both of those have water in it, okay, or you can think it has milkshake in it, whatever, it doesn't matter. Which one is easier to drink from, the long straw or the short straw? The short straw, right? Okay. And so, the length of the tube also affects resistance. And so, the longer the tube, the greater the resistance, so directly or inversely proportional. So it's directly proportional, okay? And in our body, what can change the length of the tube? Maybe growing taller? I don't think any of you are going to get any taller, right? And so the length of a tube in our body doesn't change, okay? Unless, like I said, we're growing taller, okay? Then we have the radius of the tube, which is little r. And here's my example here. So you got a little teeny straw or a big straw, meaning a straw with a little small radius or a straw with a big radius. Which one is easier to drink that milkshake from? Yeah, the straw with the big radius, right? Okay. And so, if we're thinking about the radius of the tube, is the radius directly or inversely proportional to resistance? So the bigger the straw, the easier it is to drink from, right? And hence it is inversely proportional, okay? And then, what can change the radius of our blood vessels? Well, our blood vessels have smooth muscle on them, and the smooth muscle can contract and constrict the blood vessels or relax and dilate, and hence that will change the radius of the tube, okay? Okay. More equations, okay? You probably had this in physics, I'm guessing, I don't know. But this is the formula for resistance, okay? This is our formula for flow, delta P over R, and if you put those two things together, you get this guy's law. I think it's Poiseuille or something like that, okay? Again, my French is not very good. I think this was a French guy, okay? Anyways, and so, but what equation do I want you to remember? The first one, the second one, or the third one? The second one, okay? That's what I want you to remember. What I want to point out here is when we're talking about the radius, we're talking about the radius to the fourth power when if we put that into our flow equation, which tells us that small changes in the radius have big effects on flow, okay? The other thing is we see there's resistance, and there is our radius to the fourth power, illustrating that the radius is inversely proportional to our resistance, okay? And so if I decrease radius, I increase resistance, okay? And then, there's my flow equation, okay? And put a big star by it because that's what you need to know, okay? And when I'm putting everything together as far as radius and resistance and flow goes, if now I increase resistance, I decrease flow, okay? Okay. So if I decrease radius, I decrease flow. Okay. Anyways, okay. Another way to think about it. Okay, let's practice. So, remember, little r is radius, big R is resistance. And so which of these tubes has the greater flow? And you can make flow represented as Q. I'm going to call it flow instead of Q. Okay. How many people say A? How many people say B? Okay, good. Okay, so if you do delta P, because they both have the same resistance, so the only thing we're looking at is delta P, okay, that is 50 mils per minute. This one is 40 mils per minute. And again, what this tells us is not the absolute pressure, because obviously the pressures in tube B are much greater than in tube A. It's not the absolute pressure that determines flow, it is the delta P, okay? Okay. Guys ready? Okay, so here's another one. Which of these tubes has a greater flow? Okay. How many people here say A? How many B? I didn't get very many hands. Okay. Take a guess. How many say A? How many say B? Okay. So the delta P is the same, right? So now it's the resistance. And so delta P is that. Okay. And our flow, because the resistance is 1, flow is 50 mils per minute. Here, delta P is that. But this is our flow equation. This is an equation you don't have to know. But if you did all the math, I guess I did all the math, at some point, the flow ends up being 3.12 mils, 125 mils per minute. Okay? So we have decreased that radius a lot, okay, by half. And if I decrease radius, I increase resistance, and I decrease flow. Think about, drinking that milkshake from a small tube versus a big tube, okay? And you don't have to, remember all those numbers and stuff, but this is to illustrate that at any given delta P, if the radius decreases, then flow greatly decreases. So has, like I said, a big effect. The change in radius can have a big effect on flow. Okay, so now we're going to look at components of the vasculature. And before we look at all the individual components, we can compare how pressure, resistance, and compliance is within all of our different vascular beds. Okay, so here is a picture from your textbook, I believe. Anyways, and we want to look at pressure first. And I think it makes sense that pressure is going to be highest in our big arteries, right? Because those are coming off of our heart. And so it's going to be highest there, and then it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until it's very, very low at the veins. It cannot be the reverse, right? Because remember that we are always flowing from an area of high pressure to low pressure. If it was the reverse, then the flow would be from our veins to our arteries, not from our arteries to our veins. Okay? If we look at resistance, and what we're looking at here is really what is the diameter or radius of these blood vessels. And you guys know that our arteries should have a comparatively large radius, hence they have a low resistance. Big vessel, low resistance. When you get to the arterioles, these are really little vessels, so they're going to have high resistance. And then when we get back to our veins, we're back at big, giant blood vessels. So again, we're back at low resistance, okay? Then we're going to look at compliance. And we want to first define what compliance is, and this is the change in volume over the change in pressure. This is not the delta P of the pressure gradient from one end of the tube to the other, okay? What we're talking about here is just the change in transmural pressure, so that would be the change in the pressure within the blood vessel in that area if you change the volume in that part of the blood vessel, okay? And this is essentially how easily a blood vessel will distend. So if we have a very compliant tube, then if we put a bunch of blood in there, and there is not a great change in pressure, meaning the blood vessel has distended a lot, then this, I think that was the end of it. So we put a bunch of blood in there, and it doesn't change the pressure much, then that's a very compliant tube. If we put a bunch of blood in there and that causes a great increase in pressure, then that's a non-compliant tube. Okay? Okay? And so this depends on how stiffness the walls of our blood vessels are. So nice, healthy blood vessels that are compliant, not all of our blood vessels are compliant, but the ones that are compliant, if they're nice and healthy, okay, you know, they're not very stiff. But with some diseases, and mainly what we're talking about, if you have like atherosclerosis, that makes those blood vessels much stiffer and less compliant, okay? Okay, so if we look at how compliance then changes from one group of vessels to the next, we see that our big arteries are very compliant. And one of the reasons is because they have a lot of elastic fibers. So if you, I don't have it written up there, but so if you put a bunch of blood in, say the aorta, it has all those elastic fibers, it can stretch out, okay? When we get to the arterioles, which are small little blood vessels with not many elastic fibers in there, and they cannot stretch out when you put a bunch of blood in there, so those are low compliant tubes. And when we get to our veins, they don't have a whole lot of elastic fibers, but you can think of veins as being kind of floppy, and so when you put blood in there, they just kind of open up, we'll say, okay? And so those also are very high compliant tubes. Okay, so we got that all in our head now. Okay, so now we're going to look at arteries, and we're going to think about what is the wall of an artery like. You guys, I know, hopefully are familiar with this. So there's an artery, there's a vein, okay? And we know that arteries are under really high pressure, and so they have thicker walls, and it's not connective tissue that is going to be thicker that helps it withstand the pressure. It is our layer of smooth muscle, okay? So remember that tunica media is really thick in arteries compared to veins, and that enables it to withstand that high pressure. So here's our structure of a large artery, okay? We know that all of our blood vessels are lined with a layer of endothelium. That is part of the tunica intima, right? Okay. Then we have our layer of smooth muscle, which has lots and lots of elastic fibers in there, also has some connective tissue in there. That's our tunica media, right? Okay. And then we have, here's a section of the aorta. And I think we looked at this in histology, right? The dark purple lines, right, are all of the elastic fibers, okay? So lots of elastic fibers there. And then we have our outer layer of connective tissue, which is the tunica adventitia, okay? Okay. How soon we forget. Okay. So now, I hope you haven't forgotten this, because we just talked about arteries and their resistance and their compliance, okay? But what enables large arteries to have a low resistance and a high compliance? Okay, when we're talking about resistance, right, it has a low resistance. So would I equate a large artery to be equivalent to our little straw or our big straw? Our big straw, which has low resistance, right? Easy to drink that milkshake from a big straw. Not so easy from a little straw. And so it's because the arteries have that large diameter that they have a low resistance. It's the two R's. Resistance and radius go together. Okay? What is the difference between radius and diameter? Radius is half the width, diameter is the whole width, right? Just to make sure that you guys got that. Okay? So if the radius increases, the diameter has to increase. Okay. Compliance. Okay. Why do our large arteries have that high compliance? Because they have a lot of, not because they have a large radius, okay. That has nothing to do with it. It's because they have a lot of elastic fibers, okay. Okay, function of our large arteries then. Obviously is transport blood. All of our blood vessels. Function is transport blood. And they can do this relatively quickly, meaning transport it from our heart to our smaller blood vessels or to the organs, because they have that large diameter or radius and a low resistance. So it's very easy, for blood to flow through these blood vessels. Okay, but that's not the only thing that large arteries do. Oh, but they're called conductance vessels, okay? So we have kind of a name for our large arteries, our arterioles, and our veins. And so besides large arteries, these are conductance vessels because one of their huge jobs is to conduct blood, I guess. We're going to see what the names are for the other blood vessels as we go along. Okay? But it has another job, and that is to act as a pressure reservoir. I know what a reservoir is, like, you know, if you have like a big giant tank that has water in it, right? Well, you can think of this as a big tank that has extra pressure in it. I don't know. Anyways, but we know that if I think about my hose, right? Systole, you turn the hose on, okay? And blood flows or water flows, right? Diastole, we turn the hose off. What happens to the flow of water? If you turn a hose off, what happens to the flow of water? It stops, okay? Okay. And do we want blood to stop flowing during diastole? No, okay? We don't want that to happen. And so, because of the way these large arteries are designed, okay, that high compliance plus the elastic recoil, they can act as a pressure reservoir, or you can think of this as like a backup pump, okay? No, I don't have it written there, okay? So the heart during systole is pumping blood. We don't have, and during diastole, the heart can't pump blood, but you can think of, you know, our large arteries as acting as a backup pump to pump blood during diastole. Okay. So let's look at exactly how it acts as a pressure reservoir. So during systole, if we have the aorta is acting as a rigid tube, meaning it's not compliant, like a garden hose, and say you have 70 mils come into the heart, the tube does not stretch. Oh my God, I bought a new hose, and I was trying to unroll it, and it is like so stiff, you know? It was like so hard, I was like really mad because I did not like that hose, so now I gotta go get a new hose. Because it was so hard to unroll it. Okay. Water came out just fine, but anyways. I don't know why I said that. I think it's the weather. I think it's the weather. Okay. Okay. Okay, so we got to get back on track here. So this is non-compliant. So the tube does not stretch. Okay, so there's no change in surface area, but pressure increases. And say diastolic pressure, kind of a standard, is 80 millimeters of mercury. And so we pump the blood into our non-compliant tube, or aorta, and maybe this aorta is very stiff because it has atherosclerosis. I think of normally that involving like your coronary arteries, but it can involve lots of blood vessels, including your aorta, and now your blood pressure goes up to 150 millimeters of mercury, okay? But what if we have a compliant tube? 70 mils of blood enters the aorta. That's kind of a typical amount that will go in during systole. The wall stretches, and if the wall stretches, what happens to the surface area? It increases, right? And remember, pressure is force per unit area. So if I get an increase in surface area, that would have a negative effect on pressure, but I got all this blood coming in too, which has a positive effect on pressure. And so if you add the two things together, maybe blood pressure goes from 80 instead of to 150, it goes to maybe 120 millimeters of mercury. So that limits the increase in systolic pressure. Okay. Okay. So that's one thing to look at. Another important thing, so we're looking now at our backup pump, or how that large elastic artery acts as a backup pump. Okay, so you guys are familiar with kinetic and potential energy and all that kind of stuff, right? Okay. And so when you stretch the wall of the blood vessel, some of the energy from the stretching is stored in the wall of the blood vessel. That would be, I think, potential energy, right? Okay. And we know that, for example, if I stretch a rubber band and I let go, it comes back. Okay. I don't want to say it's kind of the similar thing, but it's kind of the similar, well, I guess I did say that. It's kind of a similar thing. Okay. You stretch out, you know, the wall of the blood vessel, and you get that elastic recoil. Okay. And so that helps maintain blood flow during diastole. So if we look at our picture here, so during systole, 70 mils goes in. Obviously, some of the blood goes out of the aorta, if we're just saying this is our aorta, and we're going to say 25 mils goes out. During diastole, do I have any blood going in? No. Okay, so 0 mils is going into the aorta, and now we have that elastic recoil, which again is acting as like our backup pump, okay? And that is helping squeeze the blood, so to speak. It doesn't really squeeze, well, I guess it does squeeze the blood because it's recoiling, but you got to think about your physics as you're reducing the area. And now 45 mils goes out, okay? And so that 70 mils has gone out of the aorta, okay? Okay, if we look at, you know, then the fluctuation of pressure in the aorta during one cardiac cycle, during systole, so this would be during systole, you know, pressure increases because of the ejection of blood. And during diastole, you do get a slow, obviously, decrease in pressure because the blood is exiting the aorta also, but it decreases slowly over time, okay, instead of going down really quick, okay? Okay, so say we have a blood vessel or a large artery that becomes stiffer. So, for example, it has a lot of atherosclerosis or plaque in the wall. What do you think will happen to systolic pressure and diastolic pressure as compared to normal? So we already talked about, you know, systolic pressure. If we have a less compliant tube, what's going to happen to systolic pressure? It's going to be higher than normal. What's going to happen to diastolic pressure, though? We cannot maintain some of that pressure in the tube, and so diastolic pressure is going to plummet, right? And so that will be lower or decreased versus normal, okay? So then we have a term called pulse pressure. And pulse pressure is systolic minus diastolic. So you just do that simple math. And if we have a less compliant tube, what will happen to pulse pressure? Okay. Well, if systolic goes up and diastolic goes down, right, pulse pressure is going to increase, okay? So pulse pressure is increased. Okay, this is an example, okay? So there's our regular change, the green, right, is our regular change in pressure during systole and diastole, and then maybe that's the change that you would see with reduced compliance. Okay, it goes up, down, so it goes up higher, goes down lower, and hence our pulse pressure is increased. Okay. What about mean arterial pressure? So mean arterial pressure is the average pressure in the arteries during one cardiac cycle. So you would just add up, the pressures during the cardiac cycle and average that, okay? And one of the things to think about is not only what happens with systolic and diastolic pressure, but also homeostasis. Dr. Peoples talked about homeostasis, didn't he? Okay. And mean arterial pressure is our set point, okay? So what will typically happen to mean arterial pressure if we have a less compliant tube? Okay. I'll ask you guys then. How many, I gotta see which one it is. Okay. How many people say A? How many B? Okay, and how many C? Okay, so the key here is that mean arterial pressure is our set point. So mean arterial pressure doesn't change. Okay? Obviously, there's a lot of things that can change blood pressure, but if that's all we're looking at, and mean arterial pressure is our set point, then it is not going to change. Okay. I didn't give you that, did I? Okay. So remember, this is all negative feedback, okay? And so we want mean arterial pressure to stay constant. Okay. So you don't take systolic, add it to diastolic, and divide by 2 to get mean arterial pressure. Okay? The way that you can calculate it is you take diastolic plus 1/3 of our pulse pressure. Pulse pressure is systolic minus diastolic. Or you can do 1/3 systolic plus 2/3 diastolic. Why do we do it? Why is that the equation? Why is it not where you just average systolic and diastolic? Okay, so it's because, what do you think the fraction, and my options are this, what do you think the fraction of time is spent in systole? Typically it is at rest, so we're talking about at rest. It's 1/3 of the time you spend in systole, 2/3 of the time you spend in diastole. And, the second equation is just rearranging it. But I kind of like the second one because it's really easier, I think, to remember 1/3 systolic plus 2/3 diastolic, okay? And I'm just going to give you, a piece of advice that if I'm asking for mean arterial pressure, and I give you systolic and diastolic. It cannot be below diastolic or above systolic pressure, okay? It has to be between the two. And typically, it is going to be closer to diastolic or systolic. It's going to be closer to diastolic, okay? Why do we care about mean arterial pressure? Because you need at least about mean arterial pressure of 60 in order to perfuse your organs adequately. If it's too low, then you're not getting enough blood to your organs. What about pulse pressure? Why is that important? And because what we talked about with compliance, right, if you have a low compliant blood vessel, then, you know, you have a greater pulse pressure, and so that's a better indicator that you have atherosclerosis, okay? Because with atherosclerosis, your arteries get stiffer, and hence that reduces the compliance, okay? So let's summarize. Function of aorta and other large elastic arteries, obviously conduit for blood. Acts as that pressure reservoir during diastole, limits increase in systolic, decrease in diastolic. Okay? Okay. Now, arterioles. Thinking about the wall of an arteriole. Oh, think back to histology, right? Okay, so here's the arteriole. I might have used that picture, I don't know. Anyways, there's the lumen. You know, remember, all of our blood vessels are lined with a layer of endothelium. And here you have, you know, maybe a layer or two or three of smooth muscle around it, okay? And so one of these is an artery, and one is, or arteriole, and one is a venule, okay? Did I give you which one is which? Oh, no. Oh, yeah. Okay. I just gave you the arrows. Okay. Which one do you think is the arteriole? This one or this one? This one? Yeah. Why this one? Huh? Oh, it looks like there's less blood in it. Yeah. Okay. Well, usually they have smaller lumen, right? Okay. So there would be less blood. Okay. So there's our arteriole, and there's our venule. Okay, more smooth muscle. See, smooth muscle here. This has very little smooth muscle. Okay, here a couple layers of smooth muscle. Okay. Okay. And remember about our large arteries, low resistance, high compliance. Arterioles. What do you think? Low or high resistance? Big giant vessels or small vessels? Small. And so they're going to have a small radius and hence a high resistance, okay, because they have a smaller radius, okay. And what do you think? Compliant or not compliant? Do they have a lot of elastic fibers? No, not a lot of elastic fibers. And so these are low compliant, okay? Okay, so very small amount of elastic fibers. So function of arterioles, obviously carry blood, okay? However, has a lot more functions. Another one, control the amount of blood delivered to those capillaries at any given mean arterial pressure. So, you know, hopefully at some point when you're studying, you're going to be thinking really hard, right? And if I'm thinking really hard, I need more blood to my brain, okay? And so the arterioles actually can enable me to get more blood to my brain if I'm thinking really hard, okay, without changing mean arterial pressure, okay. The other thing is it helps regulate mean arterial pressure, arterial blood pressure, and we're going to talk about that later, okay. So our last topic in physiology is control of mean arterial pressure. But just to remind you, blood pressure, mean arterial pressure, is cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. And we already know lots about cardiac output. And what we're going to see is that our arterioles are our resistance vessels. Okay? And so they help control total peripheral resistance. Okay, so we're going to talk about number 2. Transit of blood is just transit of blood, okay? And so distribution of blood flow to different organs. So this is just an example explaining how the arterioles can change the amount of blood flowing to a particular organ. So up at the top we have like our arteries, our pressure reservoir, and the delta P is the same for all organs. So if I think about my aorta, I have all of these blood vessels coming off of it, which go to arterioles, and as it turns out, the delta P, which is the pressure gradient from the start of the tube to, say, the arterioles of that organ, is about the same, okay? But then we have our arterioles, which are our variable resistance outflow tubes. So you can see that these ones are all constricted, this one is not. And hence, this is the flow to, say, these 5 organs. And so since this one is constricted, it has less flow. This one's dilated, it has greater flow. Okay, and remember that flow is delta P over R. Since delta P is the same, the resistance is different, and hence the flow is different. Okay, so that might be how it is, but then how does the body ensure that a particular organ is supplied with sufficient blood to meet its metabolic demands? Okay. So say I'm thinking really hard, right? Okay. And I need more blood to my brain. And so I need more blood flowing there, we'll say. And how am I going to get more blood there? What is going to change? Well, it's not going to be by changing resistance of veins, because that's after, right? It's not by changing mean arterial pressure, because that would change flow to all of my organs, and I'm only want to get more flow to my brain, okay? And capillaries don't have any smooth muscle, so there's no way to change the resistance there. And our arterioles are our resistance organs. Or resistance blood vessels, rather. And so it's by changing the resistance, okay? If I change the resistance of the aorta, that probably will change my delta P because I'm way up at the top, okay? So, and change then the flow to all of the organs. But if I change the resistance of the arterioles that is supplying that organ, I will change the amount of blood that is flowing to that organ, okay? And let's take our break, okay? And we can come back in about 10 minutes. I'm just looking to see where I'm at.
Oh, you're on slide number 30.
Oh, 37.
Yeah. Can I do your question? Just this. I kind of understand the answer why I would see it. And I guess if you could just explain what the diastolic.
So if you have a non-compliant tube, what you want to think about, okay, is that think about a hose, right? I turn the hose on, I put all this blood in there, pressure obviously goes up, or water, because I have all this water, obviously pressure goes up, because all this water, right? And if I turn the hose off, all that water goes out.
Yeah.
What is the pressure? Like nothing.
So when you take off the water.
Okay, so that makes sense, right?
So we're good.
Okay, and now we got to look at compliance. Okay, so I put all this blood in. Some of the blood goes out, but the aorta stretches out. Okay, this is compliant. Okay, and now during diastole, I have that elastic recoil, right? So I still have an ability, because as soon as I'm starting to do that elastic recoil, that increases pressure. Right? We're just thinking about the elastic recoil. That increases pressure, right? Okay. But I also have blood exiting, which decreases pressure, right? But I'm not going to have as much of that blood leaving as quickly, we'll say, as if I didn't have that elastic recoil. Does that make sense?
And how does it, I guess, because I get it, like when it's contracting, it's going to be stiffer, it's like going to be harder, it's
right.
More pressure. But so for the diastolic, that's like when it's resting and filling.
That's the heart is resting and filling.
Right.
Okay. But my blood is still flowing.
Yes.
Okay.
There's no like contraction or anything.
Correct. So I need that elastic recoil to keep the pressure a little bit higher than normal.
So there's some.
Then without, if we had just a rigid tube, right? It would be like all the blood would flow out and the pressure would drop. Okay. Obviously, that's an exaggeration. Okay. But if I think about it that way, if I have the compliant tube, then I have the elastic recoil, which contributes to keeping the pressure a little bit higher than it otherwise would be. So, here's my words for that. You know. I don't think I have words for that. Okay.
I'm going to look through it more. Yeah.
Ultimately, what you want to just think about is if you think about like a hose, right? I turn it on, pressure goes way up. I turn it off rapidly, pressure goes way down. Okay? But if I have, I can't come up with another example for compliant.
I guess, so for diastolic, so like, okay, so let's just say like, it's going to be like very stiff, so that, or like, try, I guess, and for systolic, it's going to contract, harder, more pressure to get that through than one thing. So that's that. But then I saw it's not. It's not going to be. That's why. Right.
I think very important because you have
Oh, okay.
Okay, are you guys ready? Okay, we gotta get started so we can get out of here, right? Beautiful day. Okay, oh, forgot that. Arterioles. These are considered our resistance vessels. So our aorta, large elastic arteries, are the conductance vessels. Their big job is to conduct blood, also act as that pressure reservoir. But the arterioles, considered resistance vessels, because that's one of its big jobs, is to control the resistance of our vasculature. Okay. So, how resistance changes organ blood flow, I think this is really simple then. Delta P doesn't change, but if we change the resistance of some of our vessels, obviously the flow to those organs change. So this one, resistance increased, flow greatly increased. Here, this one, resistance decreased, flow greatly increased. Okay? Okay. Okay, and contraction, relaxation of arterial smooth muscle changes resistance and hence blood flow. Okay? But then we got to look at what causes contraction, relaxation of our smooth muscle and our arterioles. Well, there's obviously a lot of things, okay? But the first thing is that those blood vessels are tonically contracted, which means that they have a little bit of smooth muscle tone, or they're contracted a little bit all the time. And so you can either increase or decrease the how contracted or constricted or dilated, whichever one you want to call it, those blood vessels are, okay? And we have local factors, and then we have extrinsic control. Nevertheless, all of these things can cause potentially the blood vessels or arterioles to dilate or to constrict. So some things will cause it. Obviously, the same one thing doesn't cause both vasodilation and vasoconstriction, but some things will cause vasodilation, some things will cause vasoconstriction, and ultimately change flow. So you can fill in that information. Either, and obviously, the answers will be either increase or decrease. Okay, ready? So, if you vasodilate, it's bigger, hence the radius increases. And if you increase the radius, decreases resistance and increases flow, right? Okay. And then obviously the reverse happens with vasoconstriction. So, okay. So that was just a little practice for you on that. Okay, so now we're going to look at local control. And the first thing, response to injury. If, obviously, say you get a cut, starts to bleed, you don't want it to continue to bleed and bleed and bleed forever, right? Okay. So, one thing that happens, and we had talked about this before, or the first thing that happens is you release some endothelin, or here I have thromboxane A2, okay, which is a vasoconstrictor. Endothelin is also a vasoconstrictor, and that will, cause constriction of your blood vessels. Okay. But what we're going to focus on here, we've already talked about that before. When we talked about thrombosis. But that was the last exam. Or your first exam. Anyways, what we're going to talk about here more is these other three things. We're going to start with active hyperemia. So if you increase metabolic activity on a tissue, what do you want blood flow to do? Do you want it to increase or decrease? So if I'm increasing metabolic activity, I'm using up all of my oxygen, I'm making a lot more CO2, right? Using up all my glucose, etc. So I would want blood flow to the tissue to increase, right? Okay, to bring in more oxygen, to take away more CO2. And if we look at then how blood flow changes because of active hyperemia. So I'm using more oxygen, generating more CO2, and there are a lot of metabolic changes that are occurring that contributes to this, but the two that I think are most understandable or memorable are, will I have an increase or decrease in oxygen? I'm going to have a decrease in oxygen, and I'll have an increase in CO2, and that decrease in O2, increase in CO2 causes relaxation of our arteriolar smooth muscle. Hence, I get vasodilation, increased blood flow. Okay? And I think all of this makes sense because it's like I'm using up my oxygen, I want to bring more blood in, hence that decrease in oxygen contributes to vasodilation and increase in flow. Okay, and here are just some examples of active hyperemia. You can see that, skeletal muscle, you exercise, you're using up a lot of energy, and hence you're going to increase blood flow a tremendous amount. Also with heart, you increase heart rate, contraction, you're going to increase blood flow. And this is up to 5-fold, not quite as much as skeletal muscle. Digesting your food takes a lot of energy, so after I have eaten a meal, I'm going to have more blood flowing to my GI tract than maybe to the rest of my body. And when you're thinking really hard, right, you can increase cerebral blood flow, okay? Okay, next is flow autoregulation. And I got here the mechanism by which, and then on the other column is an example. So, you have an organ that experiences a change in perfusion pressure. That's that delta P. So for some reason, as an example, your blood pressure goes down, okay? Maybe it's because you took a blood pressure medication and it caused your blood pressure to go down. I don't know. Could be a lot of things, okay? If I change delta P, that's going to change blood flow to all of our organs, right? Okay, because I know that flow is delta P over R. So if I change delta P, blood flow changes. And so if my blood pressure decreases, will blood flow to an organ, such as the brain, will it decrease or increase? It's not hard, is it? No. It's going to decrease, okay? I see you got your little arrow there. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so blood flow to an organ is going to decrease, right? But we have autoregulation, okay? Not all of our tissues exhibit a lot of autoregulation, but a couple of them do. And what it is we're going to see that the brain, for example, is one of the tissues or organs that experiences autoregulation. So if you're just sitting there and your blood pressure drops, your brain does not like it, okay? And so within a few minutes, flow goes back to normal. So for example, blood flow to the brain goes back to normal, okay? And so this is especially prominent in your brain, your heart, and your kidneys. These are the three big organs that do not like, especially when blood flow decreases. They don't like it, okay? And so you have the autoregulation. Similarly, if you had a big increase in blood pressure, the blood flow to the organ would increase, but then the autoregulation would bring blood flow back to normal, okay? So this is just a graph illustrating autoregulation. Obviously, it can't be for all blood pressures. There has to be a limit. And so if you go below about, 60, 50 millimeters of mercury, then blood flow is going to decrease. But in the range of maybe 50 or 60 to 150, 160, something like that, it stays pretty steady, okay? So autoregulation involves two mechanisms. One is the same thing that occurs with the active hyperemia, okay? So if I think about this, my brain is always using oxygen, right? Okay. My blood pressure drops. My brain is still using oxygen, but it's not getting as much blood. So the oxygen levels go down, CO2 levels go up, causing vasodilation of the arterioles that are supplying my brain. This is not necessarily because I've increased my thinking, okay? But then there's also something called the myogenic response, and some blood vessels act as a stretch receptor. And what I like to think about is, say pressure is too high, so say blood flow, and so I'm switching over now to pressure being too high, and blood flow to, we'll just say the brain is too high, okay? And that pressure within the artery is much higher. And so would that stretch or not stretch the wall of the artery? If the pressure is higher, that would stretch it. And I'm talking about the arteriole. Remember, these don't have a lot of elastic fibers, but this is acting as a pressure, or a stretch receptor. And so if you have a higher pressure, it will sense that, okay? And so I think of that as stretching it out a little bit. okay? And the arterioles, their response is to go back to normal, okay? So they would vasoconstrict. So they stretch out a little bit, and then they vasoconstrict and go back to their normal size, we'll say, okay? And vice versa, okay? The reverse would happen with pressure being too low, okay? You don't get the stretch, and then you get the vasodilation. Okay. Next is reactive hyperemia, okay? And so you put a tourniquet on someone's arm, and their arm starts to turn blue, okay, because you've shut off all the blood supply to that arm. Then you take the tourniquet off, and what happens to their arm? Okay. How many say turns bright red? How many says turns a darker blue? How many says slowly goes back to normal? Okay. Yeah, turns bright red. Okay. Why does it turn bright red? This is reactive hyperemia. Okay. So, if I put a tourniquet on the arm, you shut off blood supply, right? Your amount of oxygen goes way up. Your amount of, or way down rather, I'm sorry. Your amount of oxygen goes way down. Your amount of CO2 goes way up because you're using up all of your oxygen and nutrients. You are producing all this CO2 and waste products. And remember that that stimulates vasodilation of the arterioles. Hence, decreased oxygen, increased CO2, you get vasodilation of those arterioles. So they're all dilated. When you take off the tourniquet, what happens? Blood rushes into your arm and it turns bright red. Okay? So this is kind of analogous to what is happening with active hyperemia. It's just that the cause is different. Okay, or what is stimulating, you know, this vasodilation or vasoconstriction, if you wanted to do it the other way. But, well, vasodilation, I guess. Anyways, is going to be different. One is because increased metabolic activity. The other is because of loss of blood. Okay? Okay, and so this just kind of summarizes all those local controls, okay? Okay, now we're going to look at extrinsic control. That's our autonomic nervous system and hormones. And so when we're talking about blood vessels, we should be aware that it's only the sympathetic nervous system that we are referring to. Most blood vessels are not innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system, so we're only thinking about sympathetic, okay? And sympathetics are involved with, obviously, regulating our mean arterial pressure, okay? We have also other hormones, lots of other hormones that are involved with regulating our mean arterial pressure, and we're going to talk about that stuff later. What we're going to focus on right now is how our sympathetic nervous system is involved with increasing or decreasing blood flow to selected tissues, okay? And we got to go back to, you know, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and all of the receptors that epi and norepi bind to. Specifically, the ones we're talking about here is alpha-1 and beta-2s, okay? Because those are the ones that are on our blood vessels. So what happens to blood vessels when you get cold? Do they constrict or dilate? They're going to, if I get really cold, right, you know, my blood vessels are going to constrict, okay? And smooth muscle on blood vessels to our skin contain predominantly alpha-1 receptors. And so when norepinephrine, which is released from our sympathetic neurons, when that binds to the alpha-1 receptors, what do you think it causes? Contraction of smooth muscle and vasoconstriction, okay? So cold activates sympathetics to release norepi, which activates alpha-1s, vasoconstriction, and that reduces our heat loss. If I have less blood going to my skin, I don't have as much heat to lose from my body, okay? Okay. What about when you exercise? You know, there can be a really large increase in blood flow to skeletal muscle. We talked about that. It can go up to like 20-fold, okay? Your skeletal muscle needs lots and lots of energy, especially if you're exercising really strenuously. How can that happen? I don't have only so much blood in my body, right? Okay? So where does this extra blood come from? Well, what we need to do is shunt blood from someplace. Maybe our GI tract, because I'm exercising, hopefully I'm not eating, okay? So maybe from our GI tract to our skeletal muscle, okay? So if we look at what is happening here, here is my arterioles to skeletal muscle. Those have lots of beta-2 receptors, some alpha-1s. And then our arterioles to our skin and our GI tract have mostly alpha-1s and few beta-2s, okay? So when I'm exercising, I do have that active hyperemia that will cause vasodilation of the blood vessels that are supplying my skeletal muscle. But also when I exercise, I'm releasing epinephrine from the adrenal gland. And I have that in little letters because active hyperemia for this is much more prominent. The effect, you know, is much more with the active hyperemia contributes more to that vasodilation than the epi does, okay? But the epi binds to the beta-2 receptors and you get vasodilation, okay? Why is it epi and not norepi?
Only epi binds to beta-2.
Yep, only epi binds to beta-2. Okay, thank you, Chloe. Okay. Okay. Norepi doesn't bind to beta-2. Okay. But I also have norepi being released from the sympathetic nervous system, and that is going to bind to the alpha-1s on our blood vessels that are feeding our skin and our GI tract, causing vasoconstriction. So I'm shunting blood from my skin and my gut to my skeletal muscle. There's a lot of blood that goes to the gut, you know, so you can get a lot of shunting of blood from the gut to skeletal muscle. What about skin? If I think about skin, when I'm exercising, I might need to get rid of a lot of heat, right? And so getting rid of a lot of heat involves vasodilation. And so if my body temperature starts to go off, the hypothalamus sense that, and so this effect can be shut off by the hypothalamus, okay? So that's why, you know, when you're exercising heavily, especially if it's hot outside, that you're still going to get a lot of vasodilation on your skin, okay? Okay. And this summarizes arterioles, delivers blood, you know, responsible for relative blood flow to any organ, helps determine mean arterial pressure, okay? You know, my little, let's summarize slides for these, okay? What I would suggest you do is go to them and say, can I explain, you know, how these things are happening, you know, okay? Nice way to quiz yourself, okay? But we're going to talk about that later. And yeah, we do have to start capillaries. Okay. Okay. So, function of capillaries. Okay. You are. No, we got to get through this stuff. You're all looking at me like, But there's nothing I can do about it. Okay. We'll go a little bit. What am I on? 50-something?
Yeah, you're 54 slides.
Huh?
54.
54. Okay. Okay. Huh?
5.
Oh, no. We got to do more than 5. Okay. Okay. We're not going to get through any of it if we don't start. Okay. Okay, so why do we have a circulatory system? It's to get blood to our capillaries, right? That's why, okay? And because this is where exchange of materials happens. And it amazes me when I ask on an exam, essentially, what is the function of capillaries, and people don't pick exchange material from blood and tissue, okay? Okay, and specifically, plasma interstitial fluid, okay? So, we have to get, things. We'll just use oxygen as an example. We have to get, oxygen from our blood to our tissues, and I'm talking about systemic. Obviously, it's the other way around in our lungs. And how does that happen? Or how are any of these substances exchanged between one place and the other? And we have 3 ways. One is diffusion. Okay. And what is diffusion? With diffusion, does it go from an area of low to high concentration or high to low? High to low, right? That's diffusion. Okay. You think about, you have a glass of water and you put a drop of, food dye in there, high concentrated by that drop, but then eventually it diffuses out throughout the rest of that water. And so here it is. Oxygen in our blood diffuses into the interstitial fluid, into the cell. CO2 goes the reverse way, right? Nutrients, hormones. They're all going down their concentration gradient, okay? Okay. And let's look at structures of capillaries that helps facilitate this. So we don't want that distance to be really long. It needs to be really short. You think about a glass of water, you put the little drop of food dye in there. It takes a long time to get, if you just go by diffusion, to get all throughout that water, okay, because that's far away. And that would be way too long for our capillaries, so it has to be really short. So one thing is our capillaries are really, really small, okay? So this is illustrating, I think this is such a cool picture. I don't know how they got this, but anyways, here's our capillary, and here's all the red blood cells in the capillary, okay? Also, capillary wall, you guys are experts on this, I know that. Here's our capillary wall, really, really thin. Obviously, the nucleus is much thicker, okay? Okay. And the cells need to be very close to a capillary. How many histological images did you guys look at last semester? A whole bunch, right? How many times did you see capillaries in those images? Not very many. Okay, sometimes you did. Okay, it's amazing to me. I look at these sections, it's like, where's all the capillaries? Because you got lots and lots of capillaries there. Okay. I guess maybe they're so small that, they just don't show up or something. I don't know. But I just find it amazing. Okay. It's like I don't see very many blood vessels. Okay. Okay. So there's larger blood vessel and there's your capillaries. Okay. Now we have two pathways for diffusion. So here's one endothelial cell, there's the other. You know, obviously can just go right across the wall of the endothelial cell, you know, so it goes one plasma membrane through the cytoplasm across the other plasma membrane. Or we have a space, little space between this endothelial cell and this one, and that's the intercellular cleft, and so it can go through that, okay? Obviously, things are not empty, so there's a little bit of fluid in there. And how will oxygen typically go, and how will glucose typically go? Okay, so when I think about oxygen, lipid soluble, can that cross the plasma membrane? Yes, okay. So that goes across the endothelial cell. Glucose, can that cross the plasma? No. And so that goes through the intercellular cleft or pore, okay? So just to illustrate that here, here's my interstitial fluid. Oxygen goes across. Glucose has to go through that intercellular cleft. What about CO2? CO2 is lipid soluble. That would go across the cell, okay? Lactic acid, lipid or water soluble? It's an acid, so charged, water soluble. So that has to go through the intercellular cleft, okay? Okay, that's pretty straightforward. And our substances moving up or down their concentration gradient. They're always moving because this is diffusion. They're moving down their concentration gradient, okay? Now, I get oxygen coming out of the blood, right? Okay, and eventually it would reach equilibrium. But essentially, we always have that concentration gradient. How can we always have the concentration gradient? Well, because the cells are using up oxygen, right? We're always using up oxygen. So it's, you know, it's always making CO2, and hence you essentially always have those gradients, okay? Okay, transcytosis is the next one. Another blast from the past, as they say, okay? So, remember we have three different types of capillaries. Continuous fenestrated sinusoids. No holes, small holes, and big holes, right? So, when we're talking about the first two, continuous and fenestrated with the little holes, proteins typically can't get across. Proteins are too big to go, most proteins are too big to go across or through that intercellular cleft, and proteins do not dissolve in the phospholipid bilayer, okay? If you have big holes, however, that'll let proteins across. What do we have more of, sinusoids or continuous and fenestrated capillaries? Continuous and fenestrated capillaries, okay? Okay, one place where we have sinusoids, for example, is in our bone marrow, okay? If you think about that, because we need to get those cells in the bone marrow into our blood. Anyways, an extra tidbit of info about capillaries, okay, is remember that sometimes we have those tight junctions between the endothelial cells that can be either loose, okay, or really, really tight. Okay, so we had the continuous, right, tight junctions where it is essentially impermeable to water-soluble substances. So things cannot get through that intercellular cleft. An example of that is the capillaries that supply our brain, that gives us our blood-brain barrier. So that's the really tight junctions all the way to where we have relatively loose, I'm going to say, tight junctions, okay, where water-soluble stuff can cross, okay? Okay. So, like I said, most proteins cannot cross capillary beds, but sometimes you need a protein to get across, and that goes via what's called transcytosis. So here's an electron micrograph of, here is my endothelial cell, right? Here is the intercellular cleft. And this is enlarged over here, and this would be where you have endocytosis on one side and exocytosis on the other. Depending on which way it's going is endo versus exo, okay? So, but you pinch off a little bit of that fluid, so to speak, with maybe protein in there, and then it travels, you get a vesicle, and then it travels off, and it fuses with the plasma membrane, and then it releases it on the other side. That is transcytosis, okay? Then we have bulk flow, okay? I think bulk flow is so interesting, okay? And there is like my little definition of bulk flow. But before we get at what is happening with it, I have this question for you. What's the difference between plasma and interstitial fluid? Okay, only one of these answers is correct, right? Yeah. So, and what time did you guys start this morning? 8 a.m. Oh, so did I. Okay. No, I didn't. No, I started at 9. No, yeah, I started at 9. I take that back. Okay, so I got an extra hour on me. Huh?
We were in the cadaver lab yesterday.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's been a long day.
It's been a long day.
Yeah.
We'll stop after this.
You're the best.
We should be fine. Stop after this. Okay, so plasma. Is the sodium and potassium concentration different between plasma and interstitial fluid? No, they're both part of the extracellular fluid, so the concentrations are the same. Okay? What about protein? Okay? So, which one has more protein, plasma or interstitial fluid? We have lots and lots of plasma proteins, albumin being the main one. And so plasma has high amount of protein, interstitial fluid has very little, okay? I want to do this one more thing. Oh my God. Because I just love this.
Oh, I know what you're going to do.
Yeah. Don't you like it? Yeah. Okay. I don't have it going back and forth though. What is meant by bulk flow? Okay. This is water and solutes, except for proteins, because remember, proteins don't cross my capillary wall. Okay. So water and solutes of one compartment, such as the capillary. Okay. This is water and solutes, and in the other compartment, such as interstitial fluid. And this is bulk flow. You take a chunk of the water and solutes in the capillary, and you just shift it on over to the interstitial space. And so, isn't that cool? I think at one point I have it going back and forth. Yeah, go back and forth. But I don't, I should have had it. I should have put it going back and forth. Okay, so, but what happens to the concentration of solutes in a compartment when they move by bulk flow? Since they're just shifting over, and the concentration inside in blood and interstitial fluid is the same, right? Is there any change in the concentration of our solutes? No, there is no change. Okay, and we'll stop here. Okay, okay.